All right, hello everybody. My name is Mr. Ansharsky. Welcome back. AP World History, Unit 1, Chapter 8. Today we're going to start looking at Europe. That will be the topic of today's presentation of Chapter 8, but also of Chapter 9. So let's look at the Byzantine Empire. Your bell work is on the screen. Basically, it's asking what is happening to the Western Roman Empire? But it's also leaving you room to answer, well, the East stayed pretty much the same. And that's really going to be what we will focus on. We are going to focus on today what becomes of the Eastern Roman Empire and how it will eventually decline 1,000 years after the end of the West. So let's look at the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire is going to embody a lot of continuities with ancient Rome, but it will also make its own unique culture that will be very influential in Eastern Europe. So the lesson objective today is basically going to kind of ask you to associate religion, in this case, Christianity, specifically Eastern Orthodox Christianity, and how that's impacting European society. So let's first look at the rise and the political structure of the Byzantine Empire. So this is going to be a bit of a review in some ways. So the Byzantine Empire is going to kind of emerge way back in the 300 CEs. We are seeing that the Roman Empire, to divide responsibilities between the East and the West, they're going to essentially divide the empire in two, between the West, centered in the city of Rome, and the East, centered on the city of Constantinople. Remember Constantinople, that was founded by Constantine, but it's going to be the political and, as we'll see, economic center of the Byzantine Empire. But despite the fact that the Byzantine Empire is in a new city in Constantinople, despite the fact that, as we'll see, they speak Greek, the Byzantines are going to see themselves as a continuity. They are going to see themselves as a enduring legacy of the Roman Empire, of ancient Rome. And actually, it's interesting that the name Byzantine, it comes from the name of the old name for Constantinople of Byzantium, is actually going to be applied by later historians. It's not used by the Byzantines themselves. They think of themselves as Roman. But we're going to see that there is some difference between classical Rome, between Western Europe, and what's going on in the Byzantine Empire. So the Byzantines are going to reach their height around the time of the 500s, during the reign of the guy with the eyebrows right there, Justinian, or Justin as I like to call him. Well, no, his name is Justinian. Justinian is going to kind of do a few things to the Byzantine Empire. He is going to capitalize on that idea of building the legacy of the Roman Empire, but he's also going to make a unique cultural and political system that's really a lot different from what the Romans had in some aspects, as we will see. And we are going to see that Justinian is going to engage in a lot of changes in Byzantine society and in politics. We do see a couple of the so-called Justinian reforms that are going to make a unique culture in the Byzantine Empire, and they're also going to make some continuities as well with the Romans. So in terms of building on the legacy of ancient Rome, Justinian is going to expand the borders of his empire. We are going to see the reconquering of key aspects of Western Roman civilization. For example, we see the invasion of the Italian peninsula, the retaking of Rome itself, the building on of Roman presence in Spain, across North Africa. So Justinian is going to be aggressively expanding the borders of his empire to try and build upon the legacy of ancient Rome. But he's also going to introduce some changes as well. He is going to introduce a quote-unquote Byzantine spin on ancient Roman traditions. For example, and always in world history and any history class you take, use the phrase for example to back up a claim. But anyway, for example, we do see that there is a continuity in legal ideas as well, because Justinian is going to adopt Roman law, but he's going to put his own spin on it. We are going to see that Justinian, the Code of Justinian, is going to be the legal system for the Byzantines, but it's an influence from both Roman law, Greek philosophy, and of course, the new imperial religion of Christianity. Christianity is going to very much influence this Code of Justinian. We're also going to see the promotion of unique Byzantine culture. We are going to see that Justinian really focuses on building up Constantinople to be a quote unquote second Rome, if you will. We are going to see him funding massive public works projects, especially the building of a massive church complex called Hagia, oh, I mispronounce it every time, Hagia Sophia. And Hagia Sophia, I'll show pictures of it later on, but it's an example of these public works projects to build upon the grandeur, the legacy, the richness of ancient Rome. It's a church, as we'll see. But he's also, at the same time, going to make a unique Byzantine identity. He is going to officially adopt Greek as the language of culture, as the language of politics in the Eastern Mediterranean. So we do see that, unlike the Roman Empire, the Byzantines are using Greek as the basic basis for their language. And as we're going to see in a second, governments promote this identity, and that's going to have religious implications as well. Well, let's look at politics in general in the Byzantine Empire, and let's look at an idea known as Caesaropapism. Or I know some Byzantine stands, some Byzantine nerd 5000. They're going to comment, Mr. Ansharsky, you can't pronounce anything. And that's true. I can't pronounce anything. But the Byzantines, I don't know. Anyway, Caesaropapism is this basic idea that an emperor, rather than religious leaders, an emperor, a secular leader, controls religious institutions. So in Eastern Christianity, in the Byzantine Empire, we are going to see a close association between church, between religion, and state, between government. And that's going to express itself in how the Byzantine relationship with Christianity works. Because we are going to see that the government of the Byzantine Empire, the secular authority, they have a lot of say in religious matters. For example, we do see that the Byzantine emperors, the Byzantine Caesars, to use a term, they are going to be the ones who pick out the religious figures in the Byzantine church. We do see that the emperors, they will pick out people called patriarchs to lead the Eastern Christian tradition. So there is a lot of say over Christianity in the Byzantine Empire. The secular government has more power than the religious government, so to say. And that's different than what we're going to see in Western Europe. For example, in Western Europe, the Pope, he's the guy who has more power oftentimes than secular leaders. And we'll talk about that more in our final chapter of Unit 1. But in terms of other areas of politics, we do see some continuities. We do see the continuity in adopting a similar bureaucracy. We do see a similar tax collection, census taking system. That's very much employed by the Romans, and it's going to be employed by the Byzantines as well. And yet, as the Byzantine Empire expands, especially under guys like Justinian, it is going to come into a little bit of a money problem. Empires are notoriously difficult to run because of how big they sometimes can be. So, in order to kind of reduce costs, we do see that Byzantine society is largely going to kind of adopt a model of increasing decentralization. It's more centralized than, say, what's going on in Western Europe with feudalism, as we'll talk about later. But there is a lot of power given to aristocrats, to nobles in the Byzantine Empire. These aristocrats or nobles, they are going to be the governors of the Byzantine Empire. And these governors basically have their own mini governments within the overarching Byzantine Empire. So we do see a kind of political system emerge in which these local provincial leaders, they have their own militaries essentially. They're given land in exchange for military service. And that's going to cause some problems, as you might imagine, because by the end of the Byzantine Empire, by the 1400s, we do have a lot of power being given to these local governors, to these military leaders. And that's going to encourage fragmentation. We are going to see that different groups of people will break away from the Byzantine Empire. We'll talk about that in the Balkans, in Serbia and Bulgaria. But we're also going to see that this weakened political structure, this weakened military structure, where increasingly people aren't loyal to the good old emperor, to the good old Caesar, that's going to lead to invasions from outside powers, especially Muslim invaders. Initially, many of these Muslim invaders, they're going to come from caliphates like the Rashidun, like the Umayyad. But we are going to see eventually that these Muslim powers, they'll be one explanation for the decline of the Roman, excuse me, of the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantines. And then just in terms of other ways that we have political centralization, to a degree, we do have the emperor having a complex spy system. We have a kind of imperial guard that's made up of guys called eunuchs. Eunuchs are castrated men. And basically, it's kind of a demonstration of power. You are my servant. I control your body, basically. So we do have a loyalty that is forming among the imperial guard. Let's look at religion, especially in the Byzantine Empire. But before we introduce that, it's important to understand that East and Western Mediterranean, that East and Western Europe are going to have very distinct cultures. And that's going to influence what exactly religion looks like in the Christian world, in Europe especially. And there are going to be, even before the formal breakup of Christianity into Catholicism and Orthodoxy, we are going to see unique cultures forming. And we see that especially in four ways. For one reason, we are going to see that there is a difference in language between East and West. The West is largely going to speak Latin, and the East largely Greek. Remember, they're speaking Greek because of guys like Justinian. He's saying, hey, guess what? The official language of society is Greek now. So we do see a difference in language even before what we'll talk about in a second, the Great Schism. We do see that Latin is largely not a language utilized or spoken by the common person, and largely that language is going to be Latin. Nobody speaks Latin, especially none of these Germanic invaders that settled in the Western Roman Empire. So we do see that Latin is reserved for elites, reserved for religious elites, especially, whereas Greek is more accessible. Greek is spoken by everybody in the Byzantine Empire. But we also have a difference in who exactly is in charge of these religions. Because in the Catholic or Western Christian tradition, as we'll see, it's largely going to be the leadership of the Pope. And the Pope is going to have kind of a lot of political and economic and religious say over Western Europe. Whereas in the East, the religious leaders are known as patriarchs. They are going to be the leaders religiously of the Byzantine Christian world. But we also have a difference in the idea of how important the non-religious or secular government is. Because in the West, increasingly, the Pope is the only stable political figure you can think when you think about it. Because Europe is in a state of chaos. There is a bunch of feudalism going on. And as such, the Pope is going to have a lot more political power than, say, religious leaders, the patriarchs in the East. We have that idea of Caesaropapism, the idea that the Caesar, that the emperor appoints and picks out religious leaders. But one of the most biggest cultural controversies is the idea of iconoclasm. Essentially, it's going to be a debate about a thing called icons. Icons are basically religious pictures, and they have religious significance. They're blessed by a religious leader, a patriarch in the case of Eastern Europe, and there's going to be a big old controversy among Christian leaders in the early 1000s about whether or not these icons can be directly prayed to. Because remember, Christianity is a monotheistic religion. There's only one God. But if you're worshiping or praying to an icon, are you really worshiping God? Well, that's going to be a big break between East and West, because in the West, icons, that's going to be viewed as something you shouldn't pray to. Whereas in the East, it's kind of more acceptable. Praying to an icon is a way to pray to God, the way to pray to a divine being. And eventually there's going to be this big meeting between leaders, between the Patriarch of Constantinople, between the Pope in Rome, and we do see a huge fight break out. And this fight results in something called the Great Schism. So we are going to see that there will be a formal break of two branches of Christianity. And that's going to be Catholicism, Roman Catholicism in the West, centered in the city of Rome, and Orthodox Christianity, Eastern or Greek Orthodox is sometimes called, centered in the city of Constantinople. So the Great Schism is going to lead to the creation of two unique forms of Christianity. And we can kind of see in that chart right there the differences between these basic differences between these religions. One religion has Latin, the other has Greek. But we're also going to see that that has a political difference as well. The Eastern or Orthodox Christian church is largely going to see that its power is in the hands not of religious leaders, but of the secular world, of the Caesar, of the emperor. But in the West, power is in the hands of the Pope. And the Great Schism is important for a few reasons. For one thing, it helps explain why Eastern and Western Europe are so culturally different. And we're going to see instances of how unsimilar, you could say, culture is between the East and the West. But we're also going to see that in order to compete for more converts, for more followers, that there is going to be a spreading of both Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy. We do see that the states, that the government of the Byzantine Empire, they're going to promote the spread of Orthodox faith. We see the creation of missionaries going into Slavic communities in Eastern Europe. And we're also seeing Western Christians, Western Catholics, I should say, they're also sending in missionaries to compete with the Eastern Orthodox faith. But this religion is going to spell out in the creation of a unique form of Byzantine culture. And Byzantine culture, unlike Western Europe, is going to adopt more explicitly ideas of ancient Greece, the ideas of Hellenism. And Hellenism combined with Christianity, that's going to be the basis of Byzantine culture. But as with the involvement of the state, as with the involvement of government in religion, in that idea of Caesaropapism, we do see that the Byzantine Empire, the Byzantine secular government, is going to be very active in promoting Byzantine culture, both internally and externally. And speaking of externally, we'll look at some internal developments in a second. But externally, the Byzantine government is going to be very aggressive in promoting missionary activity. We are going to see the spread of Eastern Orthodox faith thanks to missionaries like our boys depicted in this icon right here, Saint Cyril and Saint Methodius. Cyril and Methodius, they are going to be very active promoters of Eastern Orthodoxy in in Eastern Europe, especially in what is today modern day Russia slash Belarus, Ukraine, those sorts of places. And they are going to be kind of an example of the strength of Byzantine culture and its legacy on future developments. There we go. Because we are going to see that with the spread of Orthodox Christianity, we're also seeing the spread of the Byzantine Empire's language. And this language, of course, is Greek, but it's going to combine together with Slavic languages to form what is known as Cyrillic language. So Cyrillic language, the Cyrillic alphabet specifically, is going to be the basis of modern day Slavic languages like Russian, like Czechoslovakian, or that's not a language, like Slovakian, that is a language, like Ukrainian, like Belarusian. So in addition to this linguistic spread, we are going to see that there will be the creation of a unique form of Byzantine art. This Byzantine art largely reflects the importance of Christianity. So systems of belief and their practices influencing the creation of a unique Byzantine culture. And this Byzantine culture often expresses itself in art and architecture. In terms of art, it's going to express itself in things like that, which is an icon, religious images mostly. But we also see the use of gold leaf as well as very attractive to Eastern European pagans, to Eastern European non-Christians. We're also going to see that the legacy of Rome will be felt in terms of architecture. We do see that the Byzantines will fund what is essentially kind of major infrastructure, major architectural projects. We see aqueducts and roads and whatnot and walls, but we also see the building of things like churches. And one of the biggest is a building known as Hagia Sophia. And we'll talk about that in a second. But the Hippodrome, just to get that out of the way, it's a big old stadium. It's like how the Romans built stadiums, right, my dudes? So ideas of urban planning, those are borrowed heavily from the Romans. But Hagia Sophia is probably the most notable example of Byzantine art. So let's look at that. Let's look at Hagia Sophia. And this is the original kind of estimate of what it looked like. It has domes and arches. Guess who else had domes and arches? You'd be right if you said it was the Romans. And eventually, Hagia Sophia is going to eventually become a mosque, a Islamic house of worship, but we'll talk about that more later. The reason why you can tell it's a mosque, it's got these big old towers, these minarets. And in general, kind of, there is somewhat of an expectation on the AP to be familiar with basic ideas of architecture, especially as it relates to ideas of syncretism. And then these are some icons. They're cool. It's that idea of gold leaf, of religious scenes. They're very religious scenes, all of them. That's Jesus in the center. So you should be able to answer this question right here. How is Christianity evolving even before the Great Schism? Think about differences in language, differences in who's in charge of the religion, different other differences. But also think about what role might the government of Byzantium, of the Byzantine Empire, have played in promoting these differences? Think about that idea of Caesaropapism, especially, hint, hint. So let's look at the economy and then let's look at some women. Haha, Mr. Ancharsky, you're so funny. Yes, you're the greatest teacher ever who's inspired so much joy and learning. Oh, God. You know what? I'm done. I'm done with this. Actually, I'm not done with this. This is my job. I have to get paid. All right, let's look at the economy. Well, the economy is largely going to be based on trade. The Byzantine Empire is at the end of the Mediterranean Sea trade networks, is at the end of the Silk Road, and as such, it is going to be heavily involved in trade. And we do see that there are attempts by the Byzantines to promote a common economy. We do see, for example, the minting of shared coins, the protection of merchants along trade routes. Awesome sauce. And that's going to lead to a lot of wealth coming into the Byzantine Empire, at least initially. Constantinople is not only the political and religious center, of the Byzantine world, but it's also the center economically speaking. We do see that there's a strong preference for Constantinople by the Byzantine emperors. And as such, we do see a lot of resources and wealth being funneled in to make this the best city in the world, at least in the Eastern Mediterranean. However, that being said, that's going to cause some economic problems because Constantinople is the favorite child. Every other city in the Eastern Mediterranean that the Byzantines have, that's the redheaded stepchild. And as we all know, redheaded stepchildren are terrible and they should be excluded from public life. Anyway, I'm not, because I have red hair. Anyway, so we are going to see that there's a lot of resources being funneled into the city of Constantinople, not so much going to be going to other places. And that's going to lead to a very weakened economy, especially towards the end of the Byzantine Empire. Hopefully they don't put all of their ducks in one basket, so to say. Hopefully they don't get invaded. Hopefully they don't get invaded by the Ottoman Turks in 1453. But also trade is opening up the Byzantine Empire to rather unfortunate things. We do see the spread of sickness, of illness, of plague into Constantinople, thanks to these trading networks as early as the Justinian reign. And that is going to be what is known as the Plague of Justinian. It will kill a lot of people, meaning that we do see a reduction in trade and urbanization, especially outside Constantinople. And interestingly enough, this isn't the last time that the quote-unquote Plague of Justinian will be in Europe. We are going to see, as we'll talk about later, the Black Death, the bubonic plague. Some people speculate that the Plague of Justinian is the Black Death, or at least, disregard this term Black Death. It is a form of what is called bubonic plague. So we'll talk about the Black Death much more in our second unit and how that impacts the world. Well, let's look at society. Well, it's important to remember that Christianity is the basis of society in the Byzantine Empire. Politically, religiously, of course, obviously, culturally, but also socially as well. We have different society ideas and norms that will be heavily influenced, I shouldn't do that, by Christianity. Go away. So Christianity is going to influence a lot of developments in Eastern Orthodox Christianity and in Byzantine society as a whole. But we're also going to see that there is going to be a bit of a unique forms of gender in the Byzantine Empire. So gender is going to be rather similar to some developments that we talked about before, but it's also different. So we see some continuities with Rome, for example. We do see that Byzantine women largely have to be excluded from public life, much like Islamic society. We see a difference in terms of or a similarity, I should say, a similarity between the Islamic world and the Byzantine world because of this idea of excluding women from public life, the idea of having a veil around women. That is going to be something similarly practiced between the Byzantines and in Islamic society, in the Abbasid Caliphate especially. However, that being said, there are some rights for women, much like with the Islamic world. For example, women can own property, especially thanks to reforms by female rulers that we'll talk about in a second. Women can inherit things from their fathers. Excellent, wonderful, good for them. But we also are going to see something that's different from the Islamic world. We do see the political role of women, at least some examples of female rulers. For example, and of course I'm using the best phrase in AP World History, for example, we do see the reign of at least two female figures. And one of the most notable is going to be this lady in the mosaic by the name of Theodora. Theodora is Justinian's wife. But after he dies, she becomes emperor in her own right. And much like her, we do see Irene as well. She'll come later on in Byzantine history. But both of these female emperors, these empresses, they are going to introduce a lot of reforms designed to protect women. For example, we do see that women are going to be, there will be, what are they called? We are going to see legal punishments for women who have violence committed against them. It's a crime to do violence against women because of these reforms. That's just one example. So we are seeing that there are kind of very explicit legal rights that will be granted to women thanks to reformers like female rulers, like Theodora and Irene. And you can see both of them on these images right here. This is Theodora, this is Irene on coin. So thinking back to the Islamic world, how are ideas of gender similar or different? What rights do women have in the Islamic world? What rights do they not have in the Byzantine world? What are some similarities in terms of the idea of gender hierarchy? But finally, let's end the let's end the Byzantine Empire. Well, the Byzantine Empire is largely going to decline for four reasons, actually. And one of those reasons is going to be that there will be a eventual, oh my God, we will eventually see that there will be a decline in economic activity. The Silk Road is slowing down by the 1200s, as we will see, or excuse me, it was slowing down prior to the 1200s until the Mongols, but we'll talk about that later. We are going to see that there is a lot of political instability because of this system of granting land to nobles in exchange for fighting. We are going to see in general kind of these ideas of oh my God, we are going to see these ideas. Don't look at my Discord. We are going to see this general kind of political instability that's occurring. And that is going to kind of lead to a lot of invaders from the outside. So politically, we do have people declaring their independence. We do have little kingdoms forming and carving up the Byzantine Empire. But there are the final nail in the coffin actually is going to be invaders from the outside. For example, Muslims. We do see as a result of the expansion of Islam that key land in the Eastern Mediterranean, in North Africa, in the Anatolian Peninsula, that's being taken over by Muslim powers. For example, we have the Seljuk Turks. The Seljuk Turks, they're a group of Central Asian nomads who eventually settle down, adopt Islam, and we do see that they will invade the key, wonderful religious and political city of Jerusalem. And that is going to be what sparks the Crusades, as we'll talk about more in our second chapter. But the final nail in the coffin is going to be the invasion and taking over of Constantinople by the Ottoman Turks in 1453, kind of an important year to remember for a few reasons, as we'll talk about in a second. But we're also going to see that there is political instability leading to independence movements. For example, Serbia, Bulgaria, they will declare their independence from the Byzantine Empire and diminish their hold over southeastern Europe, the Balkans. But finally, we are going to see kind of a decline in the, what is it called? A decline of the Byzantine Empire because of hostility to outside invaders, especially from Muslim powers, but also from the West as well, from Christians in Western Europe. So one of the kind of major economic and political competitors with the Byzantine Empire is going to be the city-state of Venice. We'll talk about Venice more later on, but they're going to emerge as a dominant trading power in the Mediterranean Sea. And they're going to compete heavily with the Byzantines, especially for dominance of the Eastern Mediterranean. And actually, that will lead to instances of political violence. We will see wars. And one of the most notable, actually, is going to be the crazy event known as the Fourth Crusade. And essentially, what happens in the Fourth Crusade is that Venetians are going to back, for their own political purposes, a pretender to the throne of the Byzantine Empire. And along the way to get to Jerusalem, which is the main goal of all the Crusades, we are going to see that rather than storming Jerusalem as intended, the Byzantines are going to be stormed by these Venetian crusaders, by these French and Venetian crusaders, and we do see the literal sacking and burning down of the city of Constantinople. And we'll talk about the Fourth Crusade more later on, but it's one of the major reasons why the Byzantines decline. And I have a relatable meme, it's one of them Drake memes, right? Like Drake, he's the kind of guy who would cry at the loss of Constantinople. I don't know. I'm trying, guys. I'm really trying to be, cool and hip with the times. Am I right? Yeet. Is that a thing still? Anyway, Slavs, they're going to declare their independence. But why is the Byzantine Empire important? Well, it's important for really two reasons. One of those reasons is that the Byzantine Empire will be essentially the model in which many Eastern European societies, namely Russia, will create their society on. They will base their society on what went on in the Byzantine Empire. So, for example, we see the spread of the Cyrillic language thanks to guys mostly like Cyril, like Methodius. We do see the spread of a Greek-based language across Eastern Europe thanks to the Byzantines. We also see the spread of Christianity, of Orthodox Christianity specifically, because of the Byzantines. And they are going to help explain why East and Western Europe are so culturally different, linguistically and religiously. And you can kind of see the legacy of the Byzantines in the Russian Empire, as we'll talk about later. For example, they used this symbol right here of the double-headed eagle. That was a Byzantine symbol, and it's going to be used by the Russians. We also are going to see that Russia will say that it's trying to be the third Rome, the first being Rome, the second being Constantinople, the third being the city of Moscow. But we'll talk about that later. But finally, the Byzantine Empire is important mostly because it fell, mostly because it declined. And 1453, oftentimes historians call it the start of the modern era. And it's the start of the modern era for two reasons. For one thing, we are going to see that because of the fall of Constantinople, there's going to be a lot of refugees, a lot of scholars, a lot of Christian, Greek, and Latin-speaking scholars who are going to flee to the Christian world. And they're going to flee to the place they are trading with the most. They are going to trade the most with Italy. And we are going to see that the migration of Greek and Latin scholars, they're going to Rome. They're going to places like Florence. And that's going to start what will become the Renaissance. The Renaissance is a rebirth in Western Europe of interest in the classics of Rome and Greece. The fall of Constantinople is also important because when the Ottomans invade, they get a new capital. So we are going to see that the Ottoman Empire will emerge largely at the expense and decline of the Byzantines. And we'll talk about the Ottomans much more later on. They're my favorite society that we talk about. In addition to the Mongols are pretty fun to talk about too. But the Ottomans, they're going to kind of build their legacy off the collapse of the Byzantine Empire. But finally, the end of Christian rule over Constantinople, remember the Ottomans are Muslim, the end of Christian rule over Constantinople, that is going to lead to Europe no longer having a friendly Christian kingdom at the end of the Silk Road. Muslim powers are going to make it harder to trade along the Silk Road. And if only there was another way to get to Asia, overseas. So the fall of Constantinople is going to pressure Western European societies to begin the age of exploration, which we'll talk about more in Unit 4. So watch this video if you have time. It's a fun one. It's a TED-Ed video of the rise and fall of the Byzantine Empire. Pretty cool video. We're not going to watch it. But you should be able to describe the importance, the legacy of the Byzantine Empire. So that was all for today. Thank you very much for your attention. Have a great rest of the day. And